Ladies and gentlemen, welcome from me, Rob Bonnet, to a day of discussion and learning on sports ground safety. We hope that you'll take away a further appreciation of its importance and a determination to be leaders in the further development of measures which have now established the UK as one of the safest countries in the world in which to watch sport. I'm currently presenter, as you've heard, of the Sports News on BBC Radio 4's Today programme, but in my time first as sports news correspondent for BBC Television News and then as a sports presenter on breakfast television, I've visited stadiums around the world, football World Cups in Italy, the USA, in France, in Japan and Korea, rugby stadiums in South Africa, cricket stadiums in Australia and New Zealand, as well as countless other sports venues across the UK and indeed across Europe. Now, all of that was post-Hillsborough, but I was here at Lord's on that day in April 1989 covering an early season cricket fixture. Suddenly, in mid-afternoon, my bleep went off. No mobile phones in those days. And 2 hours later, I was on the Tea Time News putting together the pictures from Sheffield and trying to make sense of what had happened in the Leppings Lane stand. I spent the following week in Liverpool, much of it inside Anfield as the carpet of flowers stretched gradually from the goalmouth at the Kop end right up to the halfway line. I'm sure you remember those pictures. The effect on everybody, even journeyman reporters like me, was profound. And as we now know, a determination grew that that kind of disaster should never, ever happen again. My first experience of a football ground was at something like the age of 7. My local team was Crystal Palace. My father's team was Watford, and on a cold, dark, dank midwinter afternoon, he took me to Selhurst Park. He sat me up on a railway sleeper, which was acting as a crudely constructed crash barrier. There was no crush. This was a routine fixture in the 3rd Division South. The only danger was in me falling to the grass and the mud below. There weren't any goals either, and not much enthusiasm, therefore, from me for the local team. So with the Manchester United, Munich, air disaster and the club's post-tragedy revival still very much part of the game's ongoing story, I became a fan of a team I had never seen in action from a city that I had never visited, like so many other Londoners of my generation. Eventually, in my mid-teens, I visited Old Trafford for the first time. United were playing West Ham. My parents, concerned for my safety, insisted I had a seat, and from the back of the main stand, I was spellbound, not just by Best, Law and Charlton, but also by the colourful vibrancy of a scene that I had only ever previously witnessed via a black and white television. I was hooked. And the school holidays especially were spent in trips across the country to stadiums which were somehow glamorous because of the glories they'd staged and the heroes who played there, but many of which, looking back, were clearly unfit for purpose. This was the late 60s, and the terraces were becoming dangerous places, especially as the hooligan phenomenon was establishing itself. Fan segregation, after all, was only occasional and ad hoc, stewarding effectively non-existent. I got caught up in a terrace stampede at Stoke City, found myself crushed and terrified in the shed at Stamford Bridge before being passed down over the heads of the fans below me down to the Greyhound track below. And at both Arsenal and West Ham, I was present as fights broke out and the bottles began to fly. My girlfriend at the time was at Upton Park. The relationship folded shortly afterwards. And on January the 2nd, 1971, of course, there'd been the Ibrox disaster in which 66 people lost their lives. It was Rangers against Celtic, but this wasn't the result of hooliganism. It was simply the outcome of one flow of departing fans meeting another on their way back in. The mayhem that ensued caused multiple deaths on the steep stairway number 13. In England, meanwhile, crowd behaviour was deteriorating further. Fast forward via countless battles at home and abroad to 1985, and the Heysel disaster in which hooliganism and, of course, a crumbling stadium infrastructure in Brussels resulted in the deaths of 39 spectators, while 18 days before, there'd been a fatality at Birmingham City versus Leeds as rival fans clashed and another stadium wall collapsed. This on the very same day that 56 fans died in the Bradford City fire at Valley Parade, a tinderbox of a stadium with its wooden stand, tarpaulin roof, and the litter gathered below, waiting for a carelessly discarded cigarette. Whether or not the cigarette was the real cause still remains a matter of some debate, but that stand was a death trap. By then, crowd violence and the pitch invasions that sometimes followed had caused a wholesale construction of perimeter fencing, which takes us forward, of course, another 4 years to 1989 and to Hillsborough. The 96 deaths that occurred on that day in Sheffield or afterwards took the total number from those 4 incidents alone in the 1970s and 80s to 192. The warning signs for the modern game that had been present at Ibrox and Heysel and Bradford were finally taken on board with the Taylor Report, and we all know the outcomes. All-seater stadiums, the removal of perimeter fencing, which had trapped those Liverpool fans at Hillsborough, and beyond that, other measures, including closed-circuit TV and crowd stewarding. They became effective as the unruly elements realized that they'd struggle to get away unnoticed with their violent behavior. Well, now, by Italia 90, the game was starting off on the path to gentrification. England may have been sent into a kind of quarantine, I suppose, on the island of Sardinia for the qualifying round, that I spent many a late night on the streets of Cagliari for BBC News monitoring the occasional violent outbursts. But back home, with Des Lynam, you'll remember it was all about Gaza and Nessun Dorma. As seating became the norm and the environment became more comfortable, both physically and mentally, football began to attract more women and children. This new setting for football has brought with it separate issues, it's true, ticket pricing, the prawn sandwich phenomenon, and laments about lack of atmosphere in what some describe as flat-packed stadiums. And as we learnt at Euro 2016, seating itself does not necessarily prevent outbreaks of fighting amongst spectators. But thankfully, there have been no major incidents in British stadiums since Hillsborough. And in the spirit of, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, that's why the government is not currently persuaded to change the need for all-seater stadiums at the top of the professional game, although it will continue to monitor the installation of rail seating at Celtic in Glasgow. There's much more to learn about that later in the day. Meanwhile, tragedies elsewhere around the world remind us to guard against complacency. There have been major incidents and multiple deaths, more recently in stadiums in Bastia, Accra, Port Said, Johannesburg, and only last month, 17 people were crushed to death in a narrow stadium entrance in Angola. Well, it's unarguable, I think, that football creates more passionate responses from spectators than any other major sport, though boxing, of course, sometimes runs that a little bit close. And so the volatile nature of football crowds presents the most serious challenges to stadium design and the safety priorities that must flow from it. But here we are at Lord's, where the ground is in a state of continuing redevelopment. Incidentally, it remains a ground. It is not, I think Derek Brewer will agree, a stadium. Apologies now for returning to my experiences as a child, but I remember coming here to see Middlesex against Yorkshire, which happened to be a benefit match for one of the home team's leading players. My father and I sat in the front row at the upper tier of the nursery end, and the only apparent danger, to me at least, was in being struck on the back of the head by coins as they were thrown down into the collection blankets below. Now, those in charge of major cricket and rugby stadiums know that there's a minimal risk of serious crowd disturbance. But we live currently in the UK amidst a terrorism threat level of severe, which is just one below the expectation of imminent attack. And that's why all major sports events, and I include this year especially the World Athletics Championships in London, will necessarily remain in a constant state of vigilance regarding stadium security. Spectators at these events fully understand and appreciate the need for time-consuming security measures, sorry, I just lost my place here, that finally result in their admittance to stadiums. But some do become impatient, and in that there is a potential danger of crush at the gate. So the point I make here is that stadium safety is also about caring for fans before and indeed after the event, both in terms of crowd management and the creation of the relaxed but efficient atmosphere that creates crowd confidence. These themes and much more will be addressed in our workshop sessions, which also feature such diverse subjects as the impact of Brexit on spectator safety and how social media might enhance public safety in our stadiums. So then, as we prepare to hear from our lead speakers and their thoughts on leadership in safety, here now just a few items, I hope you'll bear with me, of housekeeping. One of them is a safety issue, in fact, in itself. There are no fire drills planned for today, so if you hear the alarm, it's for real. The safety exits are around the room here, at the back especially. It's phones to silent throughout, please. Though that won't prevent you, I hope, from using social media to publicize this event. You'll find the Wi-Fi code, I think, on the tables, and you can join the conversation with the hashtag #SaferTogether. There'll be a prize for the best tweet of the day. Some local geography. The toilets are back through the doors and left and right along the corridor. We have the use of the Academy Bar, located on the first floor of the building opposite, for our workshop sessions, which will begin at 11:30 prompt. There'll be 3 rounds of workshops, where in each session you'll have a choice of 3 breakout streams to attend. They're entitled Leading for the Future, Safety and Counter-Terrorism, and Innovations in Safety. Now, lunch is at 12:30. But it can be a working lunch if you choose. If you'd like to learn more about the SGSA's proposed licensing and oversight policy, you can bring your food into breakout room 1, that's next door. Then that has a 12:45 start. But there's also the counter-attraction of a tour of Lord's Cricket Ground. The ground superintendent can take up to 30 people, 30, on a whistle-stop tour of one of, if not the, most famous cricket ground in the world. If you'd like to participate, you'll need to see Nikki at the registration desk during the morning coffee break and get a sticker on your badge. And it is, for that tour, first come, first served.